Most women can explain their weight problem in a single sentence. Things like, I've got a sweet tooth, I'm an emotional eater, I eat too much, I'm a chocoholic. And these descriptions make sense, they sound right, and they feel honest. But what if a simple explanation of your weight regain is the very thing keeping you stuck? Hi there, it's Bronwyn. Welcome back to Before Dieting. This is the podcast where I take a closer look at why weight keeps coming back, not at the level of food or dietary advice, but by understanding the eating system that sits underneath your food choices and eating patterns. And today I want to add another piece to the puzzle, the role that facts and stories play in weight regain. It connects closely to what we've been covering over the past 2 episodes on access and agency. Because once you start looking at where eating begins at the family table in childhood and those early conditions, then something becomes very obvious. And this is that women with weight regain are not short on effort or intelligence, but they are working from a very small explanation of a very large problem. And that small explanation usually shows up as a story, a simple one, something that can be said quickly, almost automatically without thinking. And in fact, sometimes it's become so short, it's said as a one-liner. Who hasn't heard, I've got a sweet tooth, or I'm an emotional eater? Or, of course, the one I hear endlessly is, I'm a chocoholic. Now, when you hear those, they sound familiar, they sound reasonable, they even sound honest, but they're not the full story. These are what I call single stories. And single stories are convincing as they take something complex like weight regain and reduce it to something manageable, something that you can find an answer to. I mean, if you're a chocoholic, clearly the answer to your weight problem is to stop eating chocolate. Simple, right? Yeah, if only. But the problem is not that these stories are completely wrong. The problem is they are incomplete and telling only a small part of this larger story. And over time and with repetition, the rest of the story sits out of sight below the surface. And once there is a single, simple explanation, it gets locked in and you stop asking questions. It's like your brain has closed the case. It says, okay, we understand this now. And when your brain believes the thinking and the problem solving is finished, it stops looking for anything else. I see this as confirmation bias at work. You notice all the moments that support the story and you filter out the ones that don't. So if your story is, I have no control around food, every time you overeat, that confirms it. But the moments where you do stop or choose or think differently, they don't get counted. And over time, the story becomes more certain. It becomes more fixed and therefore less open to challenge. Now, I want to bring this back to something practical because these simple explanations are not just theory. This shows up very clearly in how women describe their weight problem and how they go about trying to solve it. A woman might say that she's got a portion size problem. And if portion size is the problem, then reducing portion size must be the answer. And as I said earlier, these simple stories or one-liners contain some truth, but it doesn't answer what drives her need to overeat. I also hear many women say, I just need to cut out sugar. Again, it's neat, contained, it's logical, problem identified, and solution is obvious. Because once the problem is defined in a simple way, only simple solutions are allowed. And this is how we end up with a simplistic and, in my opinion, insulting one-liner when women are told all they need to do is just eat less and move more. If that worked, I tell you, I wouldn't be doing this podcast. But anyway, that's a digression. Let's get back to it. When a woman explains her weight with I'm an emotional eater, she may be describing what's real, but it doesn't explain it. Because what sits underneath that description could be anything. She may have grown up in a household where there was food scarcity, or it might have been a childhood where she had little or no food autonomy, or it might have even been that she eats sugary treats and learnt to do that as a way to deal with school bullying. But none of these fit into that one-line story. And this is why the idea of separating the facts from the story is so important. Because there are facts. You know, you have a weight that you are at currently. You do eat what you're eating. But then there's the story. It's how you name the problem, how you blame yourself as the cause of the problem. And often the story has far more influence over your behaviour than those facts do. Because the story shapes what you notice. It shapes the solutions you try, and it also shapes what you dismiss. I had a conversation with a woman named Donna, and she told me she started gaining weight at 14 after she had her tonsils removed. And there will be truth in that. If you think about it, someone with a constant sore throat may not want to eat very much. But what matters for Donna is that that story stopped there. There was no further inquiry, there was no curiosity, just a conclusion that became fixed. Because let's face it, for a 14-year-old, if the weight change happened at the same time as the tonsils were removed, then in her mind, the tonsils must somehow be responsible for controlling weight. And if the tonsils are gone, she has no control over her weight. Donna is now in her 50s, and logically she knows that explanation doesn't make sense. But this repeated retelling of a family story kept her stuck for decades. It stopped her from looking beyond it to understand what else might have been creating the weight change. Another common example of these simple single stories is the idea of being a chocoholic. And it sounds light, it sounds almost humorous, something you could say out loud and have people understand it rather than judge you. But it touches on a different problem with these stories, and that is it suggests an identity, not a behaviour. And once something becomes part of your identity, it becomes much harder to question. So there is a real cost of these single stories, and they don't just simplify the problem, they reduce your capacity to see it differently and question its validity. But we also need to think about that these stories can protect you in some way. Because if the story is simple, you don't have to look deeper. You don't have to revisit uncomfortable experiences. You don't have to sit with uncertainty. So in one sense, the story can be doing an effective job. But the trouble is it comes at a cost. And that cost is it stops you going deeper. It stops you trying to identify root causes. And we know that if you stay on the surface, then you're limited to surface-level solutions, which is why so many women find themselves stuck in that cycle of, I know what to do, I just don't do it. I mean, that sentence alone is a perfect example of a single story, because it assumes that the problem is one of execution, not one of understanding. But if you look at it differently, it might sound more like I'm using a solution that doesn't match the system that's driving my eating behaviour. Now, I know that's a mouthful, and no pun intended, and you would never say it out loud, but it's a very different position and more accurate than the blaming statement of I can't stick to a diet. So what's needed is something that opens up to different questions. Instead of concluding an identity of being a chocoholic and think that cutting out chocolate is the answer, instead you can become curious about how much chocolate does it take to satisfy you. What are the common situations where you need chocolate? And what role did chocolate play in your childhood? Now, those questions may not give you an immediate answer, which is exactly why they're valuable, because they keep the inquiry open and allow you to go deeper. And this brings me to one of the pivotal messages I want to get out to women with weight regain. When you're working to solve a complex problem such as weight regain, there is no simple or single cause or solution. So be cautious of the story that comes to mind most easily, the one that you've repeated so often that it feels like the truth, because that is the one that really needs to be questioned. And if you can do that, even slightly, you can create space for something greater to emerge. So let me sum up. When you're trying to make sense of something as complex as weight regain, start by separating the facts from the story, because those simple one-line explanations can keep you stuck. Not because they're completely wrong, but because they don't tell the whole story. If this episode has helped you see your weight explanation differently, that's where the work starts. It's not about finding a better single story. It's about uncovering the complete one that you have, the one that explains things, not criticises you. And if you're ready to dig deep into your food story, head over to the Waiting for Happiness website. We've got some diagnostics there that are designed to uncover your eating patterns and the history behind them. And also, if you, like me, want to end the blaming and shaming of women around weight, please leave a comment and a review so other women can find the podcast. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, please pass the link on. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk with you next week.